Right, as the participants trickle in, I think it's a good time for us to begin. Good evening, everyone. My name is Orgo Sengupta, and I'm the founder and research director of the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. On behalf of everyone at Vidhi, it's a real pleasure to have you with us today on what is a significant milestone in our journey, the opening of our Maharashtra office with the launch of Vidhi Maharashtra's briefing book titled 15 Legal Reforms for Maharashtra. Now, as I was thinking about what to say for this, I thought back to another warm summer day in 2014 when Vidhi's first briefing book was launched in Delhi and we had our first public event. Looking through my notes, I had said that day that the idea of Vidhi is both in its being and in its becoming. In its being, because of the fact, in its being, because of the fact that what we were setting up was new. A think tank focused on law and governance hadn't been tried in India before, and it was a new idea. But it was also an idea in its becoming because the challenges and opportunities were ahead of us and the path was unknown. Today, as we open up a new innings in Maharashtra, I'm delighted to say that the idea of Vidhi is still in its being as well as its becoming. In its being, because of the fact that after Vidhi set up its office in Karnataka in 2017, Maharashtra represents a fulfillment of our mission to try and ensure better laws and better governance at every level, particularly state and local levels, which are close to the people. And equally, it is in its becoming because the challenges and opportunities lie ahead, especially now that we are at this dawn of a post COVID world and the future looks really uncertain. So, to everyone who has been part of this journey so far, both in Vidhi nationally as well as in Maharashtra and Karnataka, thank you very much for your support. And for everyone who's here today, we hope to do this together with you so that Vidhi Maharashtra can fulfill its mission of better governance and better laws. With these very brief words, I'd like to invite Irina Vittal, a member of our board of directors and our constant guiding light, to say a few words. Irina.
Thank you, Orho. Thank you all for joining us today as Vidhi Forming Committee Maharashtra. If you know Vidhi, you know that the team at Vidhi is world class. I mean, this team would be the nucleus of any world class law firm anywhere in the world. And it's only because they are so passionate about India and they're so passionate about governance that we have the privilege of having them do this kind of pro bono work instead of building personal reputations and personal fortunes. So on my behalf and on all of your collective behalf, Vidhi Fellows, thank you. Thank you for being, thank you for becoming, and thank you for everything that you're doing. Maharashtra, it's such a special state. I'm not getting into the economic numbers and the statistics, all of us know. But for anybody who's lived in Maharashtra, you feel the energy, you feel the grit, you feel the beauty of a state that invites so many non-Maharashtrians into it continuously and absorbs them and spits them out occasionally, but is a microcosm of the idea of India, as Mr. Khilnani said. And it's also personal to a lot of us. I remember being an 18-year-old getting off a train and almost being romanticized the Pedder Road. I don't know, there's a photo in my head and I think it's become more romantic as years have gone by. But I remember Pedder Road, I remember that quaint little bridge, I remember the lights. And it seems so special for an 18-year-old girl visiting from Hyderabad. But those lights have been dimming for some time now. They've been dimming because the economic model of Maharashtra is up for discussion. It does not attract capital. It does not attract wives of CEOs. They prefer the climate of another city and the infrastructure of yet another. We're losing investments coming into Maharashtra. It's dimming because the richest municipality in Asia struggles to fix anything beyond roads at a ward level. And last year, we even had Island Bombay flooded, which had never happened in the 20, 25 years that I've known Bombay. It's dimming because the social contract between its citizens and the government is at frail. It's dimming because the state of Maharashtra is the most water challenged. Surprising for a state that produces so much of sugar. But it shouldn't be like this. And I think that's why we are all here. It shouldn't be like this because this state has land, it has capital, it has a good bureaucracy, it has reasonably good politicians as most states do. And more importantly, it has all that energy that we talk about. And it's time for Maharashtra to rejuvenate itself. Post-COVID, maybe this is the time for us to revisit, for Maharashtra to revisit. Maybe it's time to think about a new economic model, a new social contract with citizens, a new way of investing in the health of our societies and not just in performance. And that's the journey that I think Vidhi wants to be part of. So I wish Vidhi all the very best. And I thank each of you for caring about Maharashtra and caring about our Vidhi fellows. If we care enough about them and support them, I think the next 10, 15 years will be a wonderful journey as we help rejuvenate one of the most majestic states and one of the most majestic that India has. Thank you again for being here today.
Thank you very much, Irina. As Orgo said, you've been our guiding light, and I hope we can use some of that light to stem the dimming that you just spoke about. You delivered the introductory address at the launch of Vidhi's first briefing book in 2014, and we're so grateful that you're here 7 years later, giving the same address for our Maharashtra office. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dhwani Mehta, one of the founding members of the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. And as a proud Mumbaikar, I'm doubly happy to be able to guide all of you through the flow of events this evening. So I'm going to begin by introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Vijay Kelkar, and our panelists for this evening's panel discussion. We will then hear a keynote address from Dr. Kelkar, officially release the briefing book, and then my colleague will give a short address on the briefing book before we move on to the panel discussion for the evening. So we're very grateful to have with us Dr. Vijay Kelkar, one of India's leading economists. Dr. Kelkar has served as the Finance Secretary to the Government of India and was also chairman of the 13th Finance Commission. Currently, he's chairman of the Forum of Federations, Ottawa, the India Development Foundation, and Janwani, which is a social initiative of the Maratha Chamber of Commerce, Industries and Agriculture in Pune. But more importantly, and for us at Vidhi, Dr. Kelkar has also been one of our earliest mentors, and we're really honored that he will be delivering the keynote address. We're also joined by another longtime mentor of Vidhi, Dr. Ashok Ganguly, who is the first chairman of Vidhi's board of directors. We owe a lot to him for getting Vidhi to where it is today, and we're very grateful that he's here this evening. So thank you both, Dr. Kelkar and Dr. Ganguly, for being our mentors. On our panel discussion this evening, which will be moderated by Mr. Rajdeep Sardesai, we have Justice Gautam Patel, Mr. Ajoy Mehta, Dr. Anand Bang, and my colleague, Dr. Rahela Khorakiwala. So just a few lines about each of the panelists. Justice Gautam Patel is a judge of the Bombay High Court and also a graduate of two venerable Mumbai institutions, St. Xavier's College and Government Law College. Before becoming a judge, he's worked in commercial, corporate and civil litigation, as well as environmental public interest litigation. But he also has a wonderful way with words, which which used to delight readers of the Mumbai Mirror and now delights the readers of his sharply penned judgments. So we've been lucky enough to host him to deliver our annual lecture and at Vidhi, and we're delighted to have him here with us again this evening. Mr. Ajoy Mehta has a storied career dedicated to public service. He served as the Municipal Commissioner of Mumbai, Chief Secretary of Maharashtra, and is currently Principal Advisor to the Chief Minister of Maharashtra, as well as being Chairman of the Maharashtra Real Estate Regulatory Authority. So Mr. Mehta, it'll be wonderful to hear from your wealth of experience, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. Dr. Anand Bang, who's joining us all the way from Gadchiroli, is a medical doctor and a public health practitioner. He works with the Society for Education, Action and Research in Community Health, SEARCH, which is a not-for-profit working in the Gadchiroli district of Maharashtra in health service research and advocacy. I've had the pleasure of interacting with Dr. Bang on several health-related legal and policy questions in the past, and I know that we will all learn a lot this evening from his grassroots experience, even though we might be, because of that very grassroots experience, we might be hampered by his internet connection. So I think he's apologized in advance for having his video off, but thank you all the same for joining us, Dr. Bang. Mr. Rajdeep Sardesai moderated Vidhi's first briefing book event, again in 2014. And he was responsible in large part for the gratifyingly large number of people who attended. So we're very thrilled that he could be here with us again today. All of you know him as a journalist, author, and TV news presenter par excellence. So I don't think any more words are necessary. We're looking forward to a very vigorous discussion this evening, and I don't think there's anyone better suited to steer it than Mr. Sardesai. So we really appreciate your participation. And our final panelist for this evening is my colleague, Dr. Rahila Khorakiwala, who's a senior resident fellow at Vidhi and leads Vidhi Maharashtra. Rahila completed her PhD from JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, and her LLM from the NYU School of Law. She also recently published her first book, which is titled From the Colonial to the Contemporary: Images, Iconography, Memories, and Performances of Law in India's High Courts, which is an fascinating ethnographic study of the first 3 colonial high courts in India. So there's our panel for the evening. And so I'm delighted now to be able to invite our keynote speaker, Dr. Kelkar, to deliver his keynote address. Dr. Kelkar, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Mehta. Ashokda, Mr. Bose, my distinguished colleague and friend and chairman of Vidhi, my friend Rajiv Sardesai, and all the panelists. Then Arghyo, the really spirit behind this absolutely wonderful institution which is building in India, and all his friends. Let me first thank Arghyo for inviting me and giving me this honor of associating with this important occasion. I don't want to mention what the book contains because I'm sure it's going to be covered by the speaker later on, but I just want to mention this is an absolutely wonderful publication. You know, Arghyo, I always used to tell even my grandchildren that if you want to learn how to write, read Economist. But now I'm going to tell them that please don't have to go to Economist. Just read with his publication. It's so beautifully written. I must congratulate you for sheer quality. It's a joy to read. And I think it's going to be the sort of very important pathway for government of Maharashtra and many other people. But this very, very elegant publication has provoked some thoughts in me. If you permit, let me share my reflections on some of the issues which come as rubric of judicial reforms. You know, my friends, that now there is a growing consensus amongst at least number of scholars and who are working in India, that India is probably ripe for what they call third generation of reforms. The first generation was the reforms launched by independence movement, and second wave was 91, and now I think time has come for similar kind of third wave of reforms. And also there is a equal sort of agreement in my view, wherever I read about it, that this third generation reforms will have to concern with the institutional reforms. And institutions, I mean of the 3 pillars which hold our republic, namely legislature, judiciary, and the executive. All these 3 institutions requires really major reforms, and this is also now what seems to be the sort of consistent view I hear from people who have thought about it, writing about it. So I'm delighted that this third, one of the most important pillar being the judiciary, that now Vidhi is helping us to think about not just in detail, not only in Delhi, but other areas, because that's another important part of structural aspect of India is 3 pillars: central government, state governments, and local bodies. So this trinity of the institutions and trinity of a foundational structure is what I think India requires in terms of institutional reforms. So I think judiciary is absolutely a very high priority, and I have no doubt in my mind that Vidhi is really going to be the pioneer and pathfinder in these efforts. To my mind, the three or four areas I wish to invite the attention of Vidhi and the scholars in the future work if they wish to pursue this. Some of these ideas, and thanks to my colleague Sumit Bose, in our 13th Finance Commission, we had made some beginning towards looking at the issues of judicial reform. And one proposal we have made there, and I think is still, unfortunately, still valid, is the whole litigation policy, both at central level and state level. We have a number of cases are piling in our judicial system. And one of the reasons is that more than, if I recall correctly, and Argo can correct me if I'm wrong, almost 50% of cases which are the state agencies are either litigant on one side or some cases on both sides of the dispute. So there is a simple solution in our view of having a litigation policy in which national level and state level, and that will take away enormous burden which the state itself puts on the legal system and judicial system. So one of this issue perhaps may require your attention. Will greatly benefited of what you can help us. It will go a long way in reducing delays in our judicial system. Second issue I wanted to invite your attention, we may wish to think about in your future work, is that I'm donning the cap of my own discipline, namely economics. I think we perhaps have greatly benefited by introducing one concept that every new law will have to work out benefits and cost analysis of these laws. Because what is happening is that people don't look at the cost imposed on citizenry, on industry, and also system. And I think there's a great deal of passion to create new laws without giving adequate thoughts of cost is imposed. So the benefits cost analysis of the laws must have been mandatorily appended to the proposal discussed in the parliament, so that as this parliament, when it passes a law, knows its benefits and costs in terms of share in terms of resources. Last point, I'm personally very fond of, because I see the devastating effects of not having that kind of system in our laws, is built-in sunset clause in many of our economic laws. You know, argue that Maharashtra is reeling under low productive agriculture because very revolutionary land laws which enacted 40 years ago has become now a constraint against productivity. Because today in Maharashtra, a farmer even can't lease the land to fellow farmer because of this our Land Act. So acts which were probably revolutionary at that moment of time has really become constrained. So there has to be periodic review. If you have sunset clauses, same things happen, and I think your colleagues will find out in Mumbai that the Mumbai rent laws, what had led to perverse effects on supply of dwellings and supply of decent housing in our population. So rent laws again may have a very, very good objective at some point of time, but it has really requires a review by having sunset clause. So what I'm saying that we have to have periodic reviews, and so that the laws are updated which affects economic activities. I'm talking economic laws. And I will conclude by giving one example. When President Clinton became the president, he set up a commission under chairmanship of Vice President Al Gore, what he calls re-engineering government. Essentially, what Vice President looked at are laws of which are really become problematic in terms of, and I'm told, and I don't remember the number of laws were considered obsolete and removed from the statute books were quite astounding. So something similar may have to be attempted, probably certainly central level and probably state level. State levels are also equally problematic. So these are some of my thoughts I thought I'd share with you, but I'll assure the listeners that the beautiful publication we brought over with is far richer than what I'm suggesting there, but really very important issues very elegantly. And once again, I want to thank Vidhi for inviting me, allowing me to share some of my thoughts, which were essentially triggered by this. So fault is your Argo, that your beautiful publication triggered this thinking about going back to some of the issues which have been sort of, we should have worked out when we were in the government, but we didn't. But now it's really your turn. So thank you very much. And I will my best wishes for your deliberation. And I hope, my last request, Argo, please keep me on your mailing list, so I'll continue to get your publications, especially your work on Maharashtra, which I'll be keenly interested to know about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kelkar. You've set a very high bar for us with a generous comparison to The Economist. And I think there's some wonderful ideas in there for our Maharashtra team to take forward. So thanks very much for being with us. So now to the business end of the evening. First, we'd like to begin by officially launching our briefing book. So if I could invite Dr. Kelkar, Dr. Ganguly, Irina, Mr. Bose, our panelists and moderator for the evening, as well as my colleagues in Vidhi's founding team and members of our Maharashtra team, to hold up the briefing book so that we all have a nice screenshot for posterity. Great. I hope we've got a nice picture, Jasmeet. I'd like, just before I hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Khorakiwala, I just thought I'd tell you a little bit about Vidhi's briefing book tradition. So the briefing book is our flagship publication, really. It's core to why we set Vidhi up. It's a way for good ideas and sound research to translate into actual law and policy. And our annual briefing book reminds us of our mission and challenges us every year to rise to the knotty problems of our time. We launched our Karnataka office with a state briefing book, and I'm happy that we are continuing that tradition with Maharashtra. So now I'll hand it over to Rahila to take you through the specific contents of this one. Over to you, Rahila.
Thank you, Dhwani. Thank you, Irina, for pointing out the importance of Maharashtra. And Dr. Kelkar, we hope that we can re-engineer and intervene in legal reforms at Maharashtra the way you have described. Following what Dhwani said, this is Vidhi Maharashtra's first publication, a briefing book for 2021, with 15 suggested legal reforms for Maharashtra. These are suggestions to start a conversation on legal reform at the state level and to see what a resilient post-COVID Maharashtra looks like. The dominant theme through the briefing book and through our lives actually over this past year has been COVID, of course. And we focus here on how the larger role of the state is important. Maharashtra as a state has handled COVID really well, considering it has had the highest numbers at several times. So our suggested reforms, they take this ahead to discuss how we as a community can learn from the pandemic and strengthen systems for the citizens of Maharashtra. Our mainstay is to start the conversation on legal reforms at the state level. The briefing book covers a wide variety of topics, and it ranges from health, environment, and labor to education, judicial reforms, prison reforms, the role of local governance, issues of land use to increase revenue, and enhancing skill and innovation at the state level. Just to pick up on a few of these ideas and go into them very briefly. In health, for example, we talk about a large-scale reform where we discuss drafting of a public health law for the state. But we also discuss reforms at smaller scales in terms of prison reform through Borstal schools, where amending one rule would allow for women juveniles to be admitted into Borstal schools along with male juveniles. So certain suggestions, they relate to what we come across in our daily lives. So the rights and livelihood of street vendors, which was severely affected during the lockdown. And also the pressing need to focus on mental health and community-driven mental health, actually, that has taken a toll on all of us during the pandemic when our regular routines and processes have been disrupted. To come to education and courts, they are two very important vehicles of social empowerment. Both have gone virtual, but the question remains whether by them going virtual, has this made them more or less accessible? And in terms of education, you ask whether children with disabilities are affected when digital learning material is not made disabled friendly. And in the case of courts, virtual courts, are they accessible to the extent that electricity, internet, connectivity, smartphones, computers, all of these devices are also accessible? So we touch upon these suggestions to start a conversation and dialogue on legal reforms in the state and to hear from the community in Maharashtra as to how we can make better laws for better governance in the state. The briefing book is now available on our website, and a link for the same is it will now be put up in the Zoom chat box, and you may access it from here. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Rahila. And now I'm going to hand it over to Rajdeep now to get started with the panel discussion and hope for a very vigorous and interesting conversation. So over to you, Rajdeep.
Rajdeep, you're on mute currently. Sonali, can you unmute him?
I've asked him to unmute himself. I can't.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect.
I'm so sorry. I'm technologically challenged. But thank you all very much for inviting me. Dhwani, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And Dr. Kelkar for his opening remarks. I think Maharashtra is a very special state for many of us who grew up in Mumbai and Maharashtra. And therefore, when Orgyo asked me to come and initiate this conversation, I was absolutely delighted to do so. We live in times that have challenged us in various ways. They've tested our resilience. They've also perhaps tested our capacity to adjust to disruption through reform. So in a strange way, the challenges of COVID times also present numerous opportunities. And I thought that this briefing book provides some of those opportunities to look into the future and at least trigger off a conversation on particularly how can we initiate a legal reform that perhaps can enable us in a public health emergency in the future to be able to be in a better space than we are today. I'll just give a brief example of the challenges, I guess, that are faced at multiple levels. There's a friend whose 85-year-old mother lives in Walkeshwar in Mumbai, and she is suffering from dementia. She's totally immobile, but like many others, she wants to get vaccinated. When I rang up the Mumbai Municipal Commissioner the other day, they said, unfortunately, the rules did not permit door-to-door vaccination. However, the matter was before the Bombay High Court, and they were waiting for clear directions from the Bombay High Court that would enable them to ensure door-to-door vaccinations in exceptional cases involving those who are elderly or immobile or disabled. And I'm told that the matter is coming up tomorrow in the court, and they're expected, the court is expected to give directions. I mean, I think it just reveals the various gaps that exist in our governance, public policy, and legal architecture when confronted with a public health emergency of this kind. I am delighted, therefore, that at a time when we are looking at India's commercial capital, second most populous state, and one with the maximum COVID cases, we have a stellar panel with us. Justice Gautam Patel of the Bombay High Court, one of the most distinguished jurists, is with us. Ajoy Mehta, former Chief Secretary of Maharashtra, still associated with the government and advisor also to the Chief Minister. Dr. Abhay Bang, who has done remarkable work in Gadchiroli through his NGO search, and Rahila Khorakiwala, Dr. Rahila Khorakiwala, who you were just introduced to, and who is really the driving force I see behind this briefing book. So I'm going to start by asking you all to look at a question that, in a way, I suggested in my preliminary remarks, that from the Vidhi briefing book, how does one construct a public health legal framework for dealing with a health emergency like the COVID pandemic? And importantly, what are the gaps that exist at the moment that you believe can be filled in by such a public health law architecture? I'll ask Justice Patel to kick this off, and maybe each of you can briefly comment on what you believe is needed to be done to create that public health law architecture, the gaps that you believe exist. Justice Patel.
Thank you, Rajdeep. this is actually a privilege, and Vidhi and I have points of intersection in various other fields, including work that we're doing in digitization. But this briefing book is actually quite an astonishing piece of work. Let's just focus on the public health section of it, because that is obviously something of immediacy today. Two things. You mentioned this issue pending in court about door-to-door vaccination. Now, this is really a matter that shouldn't be in court, because it arises only when a court asks a public administrative body like the BMC, can you not do door-to-door vaccination? There is no law that prevents the MCGM from actually doing this in a regulated fashion, for specifying the classes of people who can avail of this service. You don't have to actually wait for a court decision to make this happen. There's one more point I want to make, but I want to preface this with something which is not readily or not immediately evident to most people. Everyone talks about the great job that the MCGM has done in a city as densely packed and as populous as Mumbai, and that is actually true. Especially if you compare it to other metros, Mumbai has been actually able to do this extremely well. And one of the reasons I suspect that it's been able to do this is because it was able to pivot rapidly and adjust to emerging challenges without being constrained by too many laws and regulations. Now, that's a very odd kind of comment to make coming from somebody in my position, but it's actually probably true. There was a discretionary element in how the BMC would respond to a public health crisis and set up new innovative measures, both at the management and at the operational level. And let me just explain. It's a very graphic illustration. When you have an epidemic like COVID and people are running helter-skelter and getting their RT-PCR tests and finding that they're positive, and then frantically calling hospitals, and you have bottlenecks, people funneling in, and a jamming up of hospitals. The BMC initiative to stop the labs from reporting back to the patients, but directing them to report to the BMC war rooms set up to direct this, then directing the BMC trained squad to go to the houses and make the arrangements, and in parallel set up the jumbo COVID centers, is absolutely brilliant health management. And that is actually what has worked, because there was room to maneuver, to innovate operationally and administratively. And this is the kind of thing that we need and should recognize. Now, if you're designing a law in a public health system, this is one of the things that you're going to have to pay attention to. It's true that some of our laws need sunset clauses, but it's equally true that some of our laws need to give administration much more room to innovate, maneuver, and respond in very quick time to rapidly changing scenarios. I can't see this happening unless there is a construct somewhat along the lines of what is being suggested in the briefing book for a state public health law. And we can, well, go through that at some point. And of course, Vidhi will build on this. But we should use the positives from the COVID health management as a template to be able to do this. Yeah. Let's not expect courts to give us the solutions. Let's not have over-regulation. You must have a law that gives the authority the room to maneuver and to adapt to rapidly changing scenarios. That's really what's going to be key here. Don't expect solutions to come from courts. They're not.
You know, that's fascinating the way you're putting it. But as we've seen both here in Delhi and in Mumbai, increasingly administrations tend to pass the buck to the court. And as you're saying, perhaps even the concept of door-to-door vaccination could easily have been done by the BMC in tandem with the state government rather than waiting for the courts to pronounce on it.
But
So what you're actually saying is
sorry,
you probably need less law and less regulation, possibly, or a minimum regulation, but effective regulation.
but you can't, Rajdeep, the point I'm making is that you can't predict all of this with any certainty, and you can't micromanage a public administration's response that is required to be rapid and effective. Now, if the MCGM, and I think any of the government officials who've had a career at that level will tell you that they need to be unconstrained without being dragged to court and being kept there waiting for 4 and 5 hours a day and being made to answer questions. And they need the discretion to moreover to do what is right. Now, I just want to ask this. Was there any law that stopped the BMC from saying that for those persons of a certain age or with mobility issues or with respiratory issues, we will, provided you give us the following information, make the arrangements to come to you to vaccinate? Who said no? Why did it require somebody to take this generic thing and saying, go door to door? Look at how cloudy the door-to-door argument is. Who are you? Whose door are you going to? When you knock at the door, there may be 10 people behind it. Are you looking to vaccinate the whole lot? Or are you going to cherry pick the ones who can't move out to come to your vaccination centers? Which is it? Develop a policy on that. There's no prohibition against it.
Let me just take this to Ajoy Mehta, because apart from being the former Chief Secretary of Maharashtra, he was also former Municipal Commissioner. And I please weigh in, Mr. Mehta, because public policy, one would expect, would be in the realm of governments and in the realm of the bureaucracy. Is it passing the buck onto the courts when you are looking in a way to the courts for direction, whether it's on oxygen supplies or whether, as I said, in the case of Mumbai, it's for door-to-door vaccinations? Do you believe having a public health law architecture would make it easier, perhaps, for administrations to take some of these decisions? Mr. Mehta?
Good evening, Rajdeep. I've been hearing what Justice Patel has been saying and what you've been saying. I've given the liberty to be a little disruptive on this matter and move away from the subject a little. The issue is not the matter being pushed to the court. The issue is, should the court put its hand into this matter? I'm sorry about this, and my apologies to everybody and judiciary, but please, I thought it was on forum where... Now,
please go ahead.
Yeah, I was in fact seeing the VD's book, an excellent book. There are 9 issues which they are dealt with, but I'll limit myself to health. Now, does every problem have a solution in a law? To my mind, no. The minute you try to solve a problem through a law, you are restricting innovativeness, you are restricting administrative freedom, and also, please let me tell you, whenever there is a problem which has to be dealt with in the scenario of resource constraints, a law cannot solve. A simple ethical issue, is it okay to allow an operation theater with a leaking roof? Or is it okay to allow a school with a leaking roof? Both are not okay. Both are not correct. But when you have constraint on resources, somewhere you have to prioritize and say, okay, let me finish my operation theaters first, or I shall do 10 operation theaters which have no leaking roofs, and then I'll look at the schools. So I will not get into the vaccination issue, because this matter was discussed as to whether host house should be done or not, where the matter is still sub judice. It will not be correct on my part to comment on that issue. But my feeling strongly is that it is now time wherein we must ensure and see and also realize that administrative or problems relating to public health or larger issues where social issues are involved cannot be sorted through affidavits. You cannot have an affidavit and an argument and a counter argument and within half an hour have a decision. There are much larger issues which need a much larger consultation in a different environment altogether, and where you come up with solutions keeping the ground realities in mind. I won't take the example of house-to-house vaccination today, but anything, even this issue which Justice Patel pointed out as to the people first, the report should go to the government. That also was challenged. It's an issue of privacy. Why should my RT-PCR report first go to the BMC? Why should it not come to me? That is an issue which I can raise as a legal issue. But that doesn't get sorted, because by taking the report in the BMC, Instead of creating panic, we reached him before he knew what was happening to him. So my feeling here has been that let's sort of now work towards reducing laws in certain areas. In certain areas, we must say that, okay, these are best left for administration and the social setup or the political setup to deal with.
So you're actually calling for greater autonomy to the administration to take these decisions. You see the courts to be meddlesome. You believe that the courts are intervening almost suo motu at times. Am I correct?
I won't use the word meddlesome, but courts have an instrument of sorting problems which may not typically be correct in this situation. So every institution has an instrument. The legislature has an instrument of passing a law. As administrators, we have the instrument of negotiating between two problems and two issues with constrained resources. The judiciary has the instrument of interpreting laws and giving you a solution. So everybody has an instrument. Now, every instrument doesn't have, it will be a sad day if the judiciary got into negotiation. What we do, we are trained to be negotiators. That's what we do. That's what we are born to do. But that will be a sad day if the judiciary got into negotiation. And it will also be a sad day if we got into making laws or doing what the judiciary does. So somewhere I think we need to realize that these are issues that can be sorted out by negotiations, and these are issues that can be sorted out by interpretation of laws, and to which it's a very simplistic thought. I may be correct, I may be wrong. But the issue is that there are two types of problems that come before us. One are straight regulatory issues. You shall do this and you shall not do this. Yes, a law is ideally suited to do that and sort that out. And then there are social issues which need to be backed by resources to sort them out. So when you need to back resources behind a problem, then it is best done through negotiation because your resources are limited. I would love to do house to house, but then resource is a big issue. So therefore, I'm not getting into that topic at all. I wish I will take that topic once the judgment comes in. But we need to think that there are issues that we need to look at before we take solutions in mind.
Mr. Mehta, I want to say that if you want to use the word meddlesome, don't let my presence here stop you.
No, I won't.
Knock yourself. I don't mind. I mean, sometimes even the judiciary's got to get up and deal with this if there is a segment of the population or of the executive that feels so, say it. Maybe we'll have to deal with it and confront it head on. That's what Vidhi does. That's what others do. We confront these problems. If you're going to run away from them, we're not going to get anywhere.
No, all I'm trying to say is I'm not using the word meddlesome. All I'm trying to say is that if you need to drive a nail in, you can't use a saw. You need a hammer. I'm not saying meddlesome. All I'm saying is that we need to use the right instruments to solve the right problems. That is all that I'm trying to say. Sometimes that narrow perspective may not help us solve the problem.
May I suggest something that I think Mr. Mehta and I will probably agree on? Where there is a situation in which the court finds that there has been a failure to perform by the executive, a failure to perform, a court intervention might in fact be the correct way to go about it, saying, please perform. But where, as Mr. Mehta is saying, the court is tasked with saying, why can't you do more or do something even more, which is typically the garb of many PILs, do something. There we have a head-to-head confrontation between the judiciary and the executive. And this is typically where the executive says, we can't do it because for reasons X, Y, and Z, and you, the judges, aren't equipped to give us these answers because you frankly can't. You're not the executive. You don't manage it. That's the point at which we have this breakdown, and that's the point at which we have this discord between the judiciary and the executive. We have to identify that clearly. A failure to govern will invite judicial interference, and I don't think you can knock it for that. But demanding from the executive that it constantly up its game, and why can't you do it? You're letting the best become the enemy of the good. No, this is the point at which you have to, the judiciary has to question whether it has the expertise to go into that, go that far or not. That's the point that Mr. Mehta is saying, and I think that's worth discussing.
Okay, Mr. Mehta, you want a quick response before I move?
I fully agree with Justice Patel. Only thing is not to sound argumentative. The issue is what defines failure? How do you define failure? If you ask me, A roof leaking, again, going back to that example, because that is not being examined by the judiciary today. A roof leaking, an operation theater's roof leaking in a village, is that not a failure? Yes, that is a failure, definitely. But in that same village also doesn't have drinking water. Is that not a failure? Yes, that is a failure. That village does not have an all-weather road connecting it. Is that a failure? Yes, that's a failure. But now the question is, between these failures, which one do you choose? And which one are you going to be blamed for? Is the issue. That's all I'm trying to say.
Okay.
That's true. That's also worth debating.
Since we are talking about failures of administrative services, I think we need to look beyond Mumbai, because the real challenges, as we've also seen during this pandemic at one level, are in rural Maharashtra, especially in the more remote districts, where the challenges exist on multiple fronts. So, Dr. Abhay Bang is eminently well placed to talk about it, because he spent most of his life now working among Gram Panchayats, looking closely at public health and communications to the poorest of the poor in Gadchiroli. Do you believe, Dr. Bang, that we need some kind of a legal architecture, perhaps to empower a local self-government, to empower grassroots democracy, to empower perhaps ASHA workers, who, as I see now, are striking at the moment in Maharashtra for what, 1,500 rupees extra that they were asking? I think the strike has been called off now, but that's what their demand was. So creating a structure for public health at the grassroots, Dr. Bang, do you believe it needs that kind of a legal architecture?
This crisis has been an identity revelation for public health functionaries like me. We suddenly realized that a term epidemiologist and as a profession can be introduced in the party without only witnessing blank faces. And as Jambuwant made Hanuman realize that he can jump over the sea, public health professionals have the power to literally put a stop to the entire society. So in many senses, it was...
Is your video on, Dr. Bang? Sorry, is your video on?
No, the video is not on because of being in Gadchiroli.
Okay, fair enough. Which is something we should talk about, right. I mean, which we will, looking at the digital divide as we talk about digitization of courts and judicial services, but go ahead.
Yeah. So in many sense, this was a watershed moment. Just the power of preventive health and public health. Dr. D.A. Henderson, who was the Dean of Hopkins, he told us in one of his classes. Dr. D.A. Henderson was the head of one of the greatest victories of mankind ever, right up there with man on the moon, the victory against smallpox. And he led the global campaign to eradicate smallpox in the world. He said in the class, no one has ever thanked me for not having smallpox. And that, I would say, is the tragedy of public health and preventive health care. When a cardiac surgeon performs bypass surgery, evidently he is considered God. But when an ANM provides the vaccine for measles, we don't necessarily provide the same level of gratitude. So first of all, foremost, the role of public health and preventive health care, which is grossly missing in current society. The second question is about law. Public health is a butcher's knife, not a surgeon's scalpel. And power of law provides an excellent handle to the knife. Public health is also not the matter of individual freedom and choice. So it cannot remain only in the privacy of an individual. That's why it is called public health. Now the questions are two: whether law is needed, as I said it is. Second question is the role of judiciary in creation as well as observation of law. Responding to this question, Sir Humphrey Appleby, in his own elegant way, pointed to Jim Hacker. Cigarette taxes pay for a third of the cost of the national health services. We are saving many more lives than we otherwise could because of those smokers who voluntarily lay down their lives for their friends. Smokers are national benefactors. In Maharashtra's context, as we know, the same applies to liquor and the excise tax. What it essentially means that only science, data, and vague notion of public health will win against the concentrated forces, those act against public health, is definitely a foolhardy notion. And the state has not really always demonstrated itself to be the most effective custodian of the larger good. And if the state abdicates or it does not apply its mind, the court must intervene. As one of our professors, Stephen Terrett, said, probably lawyers have done more for public health than actually public health professionals. And I also don't buy the nihilistic position that if a law cannot be implemented, it necessarily should not be created. As it was been pointed out, implementation remains a gray zone, but laws create cultural shift. And therefore, we need laws for public health, for fortification, for ensuring diseases are notified, for promoting generic medicines, or for stopping cut practices. The rationale should be to follow certain practices and principles while creation of law. It is said that quality and confidence of a doctor are inversely proportional to number of medicines prescribed. The same can be applied to law. The creation of laws should be inversely proportional. Number two, there should be uniform standards when a law is created, whether it applies to private sector or public sector. Take the example of the Clinical Establishment Act in Maharashtra. In some sense, the predecessor of the proposed Public Health Act. The CEA draft suggested that at the district level, a police superintendent should be a part of the monitoring committee. That immediately painted the law in a penal framework, inviting the backlash of the Indian Medical Association and the private sector. So this vilification of the private sector or other stakeholders while creation of law should be avoided. If I remember correctly, Dr. Kelkar had a board outside his office when he was the Finance Secretary of India. The board said, vested interests are welcome here. His logic was, if you are interested in something, then only you will do something. So constantly painting bleakly and blackly something as vested interest actually backfires. Second is how to select a legal priority. Now I am paraphrasing something that we apply to public health, but there are 5 criteria, 5 methods which can be applied by both judiciary and the administrator and the people representative. The 5 criteria are whether science or law has any solution for something, number 1. Number 2, what is the burden of that problem in the society? Number 3, what is the seriousness and severity of that problem? Number 4, do people consider this as a major priority? And number 5, what is the cost effectiveness of the solution, the legal solution? We rank each of these criteria 1:5, and now is the trick. Instead of adding, we multiply, and that will provide a real answer to whether legal solution is appropriate, feasible, and cost effective to any particular problem. Finally, I would say that laws should have the ultimate principle in mind, that it should lead to universal capacity for public health and not just universal health creation. So this, I would say briefly, would be the position of law in the public health area.
Dr. Bang, you put it fascinatingly in a way to try and sort of, in a way, convey the limits of law, but also sort of look for ways in which laws can be used for the greater public good, which I'll take to you, Dr. Khorakiwala, because you say in this briefing book, the central and state government's response to the pandemic in Maharashtra and elsewhere was largely ad hoc in the form of executive orders under the Epidemic Disease Act and the Disaster Management Act. This multiplicity of laws created ambiguity around the authority of various government actions and at the various levels of government. I'm presuming, therefore, that what you're really calling for in a public health law is the attempt to streamline existing laws, to perhaps remove some, eliminate some, and just create fewer laws rather than more laws. Am I correct? Because ad hocism is built into our executive system at times, particularly in a public health emergency where decisions have to be taken very speedily. So are you calling for a legal structure that reduces the space for the administration to carry out ad hoc decisions by having fewer laws?
So, I mean, of course, more laws, they don't necessarily lead to more access or more justice, as we are aware. But what we are arguing here essentially is that what happened during the pandemic, this entire, like, that health is a state subject, and this entire relationship got muddled with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we were using the Epidemic Diseases Act, which was not written for a COVID-19 kind of pandemic situation. And we were using the Disaster Management Act, which came into being after the tsunami, actually. Now, under the DMA, we have notified COVID and we are passing notifications. And that is where I think that gap is. So what we are also saying is that you need to come down at the state level, and not only the state level is the where you write the law, but you need to come down further at the community level. You need to write down what are the rights and more than rights, what are the duties of the public in cases of public health emergencies. And as we know very well, if you take any of these issues, they are best convinced and best dealt with at the most local level, at the third tier level. So when you touch down at the third tier level, you can take the most recent issues of vaccine hesitancy. That can be convincing, that works at that level. And I agree that you cannot have a law for all of this, and definitely not in a public health emergency. But having a state level law allows and gives the state that much more freedom, which was not given by notifications passed under the Central Government Act. So that is where we say, yes, okay, we need a public health law for the state. We're not saying that you increase legislations or increase laws in the state, but something like this that we have not seen before. And to deal with health issues, in this case, respiratory, so it spreads. So you need something very specific for that, because you have to account for lockdowns, you have to account for quarantining and things like that. So that is the context in which I suggest that, yes, you do need a public health law at the state level, but yes, that law also needs to account for the freedom that needs to be given, like Mr. Mehta has said, you know, at the level of the government to take decisions at the very local third tier level.
You know, speaking of that third tier level, Justice Patel, one of one area which the briefing book looks at is the fact that COVID has willy-nilly pushed us into this digital age, where there is so much of emphasis on the digitization of judicial services. Courts, even in a state like Maharashtra, which is relatively better off than many other states when it comes to digitization, ensuring equity and accessibility to legal services. You know, if I am in Bede and I'm denied, let's say, the basic amenities that I feel I deserve during a pandemic, and I choose to go to court and I sort of maybe even file a PIL complaining about inefficiencies of government, the chances are that I may not get early, swift justice. And, you know, in a pandemic, that is of prime importance, that you can't allow the justice system to get delayed because you want quick decision making. Is there a sense you get that needs to be looked at again at the state level? Each state needs to look at this process of how do I ensure, you know, governance at a decentralized governance by ensuring quicker, more accessible legal services through digitization?
Oh, absolutely, Rajdeep. There's no question about it. In fact, even from, I mean, well, personally, for many of us who have to do this, it's been extraordinarily frustrating not to be able to do anything that resembles our normal and usual workloads. And, you know, there are now far too many reasons, and perhaps that's the next Vidhi conclave when we will discuss what those issues are, because I don't think there's a silver bullet or a magic bullet that will solve all of them. But it has become a very serious issue. And let me just illustrate this a little graphically. When you have courts, for whatever reason, sitting for limited hours a day and taking only a limited class of matters, putting everybody else on hold, there is something enormously tragic that is happening. You take a regular routine case of succession to an estate. Somebody in the family has died and you need to succeed to that estate and get the usual court papers done. Maybe it's contested, maybe it's not. There's no tearing urgency. How long will this person wait? How long will that estate be held up? There's a system of justice there. It's being not addressed because of this COVID situation. We have to work around this. I want to actually know from public health officials, Dr. Bang in particular, whether he believes that we're ever going to get to 0 cases anywhere, and whether that's even realistic, whether we're ever going to get rid of COVID completely, or we are going to have to find and devise mechanisms to work around it. How long are we going to continue like this? I can't possibly continue to keep people on hold and saying, sorry, your case is unimportant because it's not urgent and I can't take it. How long do I keep doing this? It's just not possible.
Raila, you have a
There's something that we have not addressed in setting up the infrastructure to say, COVID, no COVID, here's the alternative, let's get on with it.
Dr. Khorakiwala, do you have an answer, a solution? No silver bullet, as Justice Patel says, but do you have a solution?
I mean, this has been the debate throughout when courts have gone virtual, right? You have only 55% of India that has internet connectivity, of which 98% just uses it through their mobile phone. And as Justice Patel knows how difficult that is to access proceedings in court, it's not at all set up. And 1 year has passed and that system remains, it continues, you know, you're still waiting for court to get back to physical to start your regular workload. So you have a whole year of further delay of justice, and people might not have been able to file cases also. And of course, there's, I mean, the problem starts where you need to, in the first instance, get electricity, electrify every district, rural parts of the country. Then you need to kind of provide internet bandwidth and smartphone devices. So it's a long process, and the E-Committee at the Supreme Court level and High Court levels is panning out and doing this work. But I think it needs to be, of course, happen at a much faster pace. And it needs to really consider what's happening at the district level. So here we have the perspective of the High Court, but what is happening at the district court level, what's connectivity, what's accessible over there, and that's the question mark, right?
No, Rahela, this is not just the view. I'm sorry, this is not the view at the High Court level. We've got very serious infrastructure problems drilling down to the lowest denominational court. I'm only saying that this is not a situation where the judiciary and the executive need to be on opposite sides as if they're adversaries. We're not. It serves the government's interest also, because maybe at the time when we didn't have COVID, these were not essential requirements. Now, if you're going to have to live with this, let's recalibrate, put in the infrastructure so that that one system of governance gets going. We have to just get to have a plan.
Mr. Mehta, while the judiciary confronts its challenges in this age of digitization and COVID times, purely from a governance point of view, one size clearly doesn't fit all. So what you would perhaps have as a model for a Mumbai or a Pune, which were the worst affected cases, particularly in the first wave of COVID, would be very different, let's say, to your plan for a Nandurbar or a Gadchiroli. And therefore, presumably, you would need very, very different plans of action.
Rajdeep, I'll just go back to what Justice Patel raised the issue and then also come here. Justice Patel raised two very important issues. One, he raises is COVID going away. And secondly, if it's not going away, it's going to stay here, an important function like that of the judiciary, how do we continue it seamlessly so that this at least justice is delivered to people? A person waiting for succession, an order on succession, shouldn't be waiting till eternity. But if you ask me, is COVID going away? Well, it's not. Let's be very honest about it, because the simple principle on which the virus works is that till it is in the community, it is going to keep rotating and it will be there and it will keep mutating. There are only 4 ways it can go away. One is our good luck, that it mutates into something which is very benign. Second is you find a drug, a magic drug, you eat it and tomorrow morning you're fit and fine. Third is you do a lockdown where it's a statue, everybody stands where he is. And the fourth is a vaccination. To my mind, there is no fifth solution. That's where we are as of today. Now let's look at what do you do to the judiciary, or for that matter, any other function of the state. Digitization is the answer, there is no doubt. But is it just digitization? The answer is no. Because I, for one, very strongly believe that digitization is not converting into digital format what you were doing physically. So if I was filling up a register in the morning, and therefore now I should fill up that register on my laptop or a computer, and therefore I have digitized, I have not. We need to relook at the whole system before we digitize. And digitization affords an opportunity. What you are doing today manually, if you want to just convert it into this, if it's just a video conference, fair enough, that's a different issue. But what you've been doing today manually, and that must get converted into a digital format, then let me tell you, digitization is also not the solution. Slowly you will find you do not have enough cloud space to store what you want to store. You will find you won't have enough people to feed in the data that you desire to feed in. Simple things like an electricity form. You're asking his date of birth. Why? Why do you want to know his date of birth? Everybody is entitled to an electricity connection. So the question is, we need to relook at all these forms, formats, and protocols that we have created, and then go in for digitization. That is the solution. And I think the biggest opportunity that COVID has afforded is not just digitization. It's an opportunity to relook at your systems. Do you really want to ask some basic questions? Should I really do this? Can I not do away with this? Is it really delivering what I'm supposed to do? Thank you.
You know, Dr. Bang, you want to give us a reality check again?
So I absolutely agree that it is not going to go away. So we have to learn to live with that. The interesting part, as it was pointed out, two spectrums of Maharashtra. What one is witnessing in, for example, in Gadchiroli is vaccine hesitancy. People feel that the vaccine will lead to impotence, that government is providing one vaccine to government and second vaccine to tribal community, or that of course I will lose my wages if I take vaccine. We have medical care hesitancy and diagnostic testing hesitancy. Such an interesting thing that in a hospital here in our campus, we have a government accredited vaccination center. And despite running vans around the community that please come and take vaccine here, people are not coming. On the other hand, we had calls from Mumbai that we will take a morning flight to Nagpur, come to Gadchiroli by taking a 4-hour taxi drive, take the dose of vaccine and then go back to Bombay. So it essentially demonstrates the vast difference of care seeking a different spectrum of Maharashtra. Also has been like that picture of Dorian Gray, has really showed us the creaking face of our entire medical and health system. And sometimes I hate to be party popper, but are we really learning adequately from the crisis, or we are letting go of fantastic crisis go to West is the key question. I mean, for example, in Maharashtra, do we still see that becoming the health secretary or the health minister is really a coveted position from both the bureaucracy or the political leadership? One doubts that. And possibly build on for the future. Number one is how a human body functions. One of the most important way human body functions is called homeostasis. Essentially a very effective feedback loop. Body keeps an extremely delicate physiological balance by constantly collecting data and real-time responding to it. Same applies to our health system or governance, or for that matter, judiciary also. For example, our civil registration system. I remember the meeting at Barsha. This was 2016, when the Palghar child mortality is significantly biggest crash in times of India. And so the chief minister held a meeting to review the issue of child deaths in Palghar and in general in Maharashtra. 3 figures were presented. The first figure, sample registration system, Ministry of Home Affairs, Government of India. We extrapolated SRS figures to that the total child deaths, under 5 deaths in Maharashtra annually were approximately 75,000. The public health department showed its own figure, which were 22,000. And the women and child development department's figure were 2,000. So 2,000, 22,000, really well functioning system which records birth and death. And mind you, that creates a Kaspersky position for an individual. If I'm not born, how can I die? I arrive and I depart. And that is exactly what has happened with COVID also. If you are not recorded on India as a citizen, you can just go without causing a blip on the radar. So effective civil registration system as one of the first steps towards creating good governance as well as public health system is extremely crucial. And second, I would say is one dictum. One accurate measurement, opinions. We Indians have opinions on to homeopathy to ivermectin. scientific temperament. So I would say which should be greatly instilled in the public health system.
I think we are struggling with your link, Dr. Bang. We'll try and revive that, but I just want, as we conclude, Justice Patel, just taking off from what some of the points that Dr. Bang has made. For example, a death audit. We've seen state after state not providing us accurate death figures of how many people have died. Eventually, for example, the Patna High Court needed to intervene before the Bihar government went ahead with a death audit and give us numbers. Now, all of this doesn't necessarily need a law. What it comes down to during a public health emergency is to ensure that administrations or the executive are accountable. Presumably, that's the role that the judiciary can play, to ensure an element of executive accountability to the citizen. Beyond that, what can a judicial system or a legal architecture under a public health law really do?
No, you're right. You can't micro manage through law every single thing, because when you design a law, it's supposed to operate in future, and you can't possibly predict every eventuality, nor can you design a law that's going to take care of all of these situations. Some of these are operational administrative issues. Whether or not they require judicial intervention, and if so, to what extent, is always a matter of debate. I don't think there's a rightness or wrongness, but you definitely don't need it straitjacketed by law. I think Mr. Mehta's point is absolutely valid, that just randomly digitizing things is actually pretty meaningless. But here's the good news. The Supreme Court Courts project is actually working extensively to standardize and make uniform and simplify forms, procedures, and rules. And Vidhi is very much a part of that exercise. At the same time, they're looking at data privacy, data security, all of this. But this is not going to be meaningful, as Mr. Mehta says, unless they are actually streamlined and made simple, and the redundant stuff is chucked out. Why do we want somebody's date of birth on an electricity bill? Usually it's some old archaic requirement. I mean, the classic example actually is your liquor license, because if you apply for it, you will see what it demands from you and how irrelevant that information is. You're supposed to require liquor for your medicinal purposes. I mean, there are restrictions to how much you can consume. But I mean, are you seriously saying that you need it for the betterment of your health? I mean, really, let's have a relook at some of this stuff, simplify it, make it more common sense. Sometimes we need information to prevent fraud or impersonation. So you take the minimum required for that. Yes, fair enough. But it requires standardization. Our problem on public health is something quite different, Rajdeep. I don't think we are A, spending enough, and B, I don't think we're paying enough attention to the design of public health systems, and then asking ourselves, what's the limited extent to which this requires to be regulated? We have this constant struggle, for example, between private and public health system, as if these are, one is the dark side of the moon. Why? It's all part of a public health system. Now we have to look at this in a different form, and we need to have this discussion. Public health and public health law has been neglected for the better part of independent India, and it just can't go on like this. It has to stop. And that includes the mental health part of it, which incidentally is a shocker if you look at the language. I mean, Rajdeep will keel over if I start telling you the language that is used in orders and official documents about people who have absolutely accurately diagnosed mental health issues. They have clinical conditions. You can't go around saying he's mental defective. I mean, what is this? We don't use words like retardation. all of this makes a difference. The language, the structure, all of it. We have to look at this. It's a big job.
I think, in your concluding remarks, perhaps, lies the importance of this briefing book. And therefore, I want to conclude with Dr. Khorakiwala, because she has been the initiator in a way of this briefing book. The language, as Justice Patel talks about, the neglect of critical areas like mental health, which we are not willing to confront, and which is a major problem in COVID times. And it's partly societal. It's unfair to only blame. A lot of these problems also exist with sort of creating an enlightened citizenry, aware of its rights, aware of its responsibilities. It can't only be left to the state. And maybe any legal public health framework that you frame has to ensure that the citizenry, more than anything else, is aware of its rights and the state of its duties. Presumably, Dr. Khorakiwala, your aim was to do what Justice Patel here suggested, the urgent need for a standardized, much more simplified, much more modern 21st century public health law.
Most definitely. And I think a really important part that the pandemic has taught all of us is the role of the community and the empowerment of the lowest level at the third tier governance. And I think all of these aspects together will add up. And that's why what we talk about in the briefing book, they are just the start of the conversation. But I think this conversation needs to be taken into the community. It needs to involve everybody involved, from the government to civil society and people working in the legal field. And it's everybody's opinion together that will then be able to bring some change. And I think that change needs to come in from the grassroots level upwards instead of the other way around. I think that's what's important.
We have some interesting questions that I'm just going to take questions. I won't take Samir asks a question. I'm a law student. How can I help Vidhi as an intern? I will leave you to send your CV to Orgo on another day. So I won't go into that. But Niyam asks a question with Justice Patel. Do you want to quickly answer? Why is the Bombay High Court lagging behind in the implementation of audio video recordings of court proceedings? He says Supreme Court in Gujarat MP and courts, Supreme Court plus Gujarat MP and Chhattisgarh are already implemented.
They've not implemented audio recording. That may be talking about live streaming. I want to know, why do you want, okay, let's go back to Mr. Mehta's paradigm. Why do you want it? What are you going to do with it? It's not evidence. It can't be used. It's not going to, if it's made available to you, it's the court order and the court's transcript that's the official record. I mean, just to have digital stuff for the sake of having digital stuff, it's more digital junk. Give me a reason why you want an audio video recording. I don't see the reason for it. If there's a debate about what you should live stream and what you should not live stream, that's a separate matter. But just having recordings for the sake of having a recording, and I think the question is factually inaccurate. I don't think the courts are doing, many of these courts are doing live streaming. They're not all doing audio video recordings.
Okay.
But that,
let me get a final word from you, Dr. Mehta. Mr. Mehta, because I think we tend to, as journalists in particular, look at the glass as half empty. Lawyers, I hope, usually or legal activists perhaps are also tend to be skeptical. But I think we've also got to give credit, particularly in Mumbai and the efforts that you all have made in Maharashtra, to be a little bit more transparent than many other states, to decentralize governance to the ward level. Do you believe that in a way that's a lesson perhaps for the administration also to learn, that rather than a centralized disaster management act, where the Home Ministry in Delhi decides one size fits all for a subcontinental size nation, allow every state, since health is a state subject, to enact its laws?
Definitely, Rajiv, I fully agree that we need to decentralize and let everybody enact his laws. But there are two principles from which you cannot shy away. One is the larger, what you call the contours of the solution. That must come centrally, because centrally you have many more resources to think about what the larger contour should be. So, you have you have much bigger access to research, thought processes. So yes, that is one thing that go out and come from there. Second is, again, centrally what you need to, other than laws, what you need to do is increase sensitivity. But like Justice Patel very rightly pointed out, mental health, there's hardly any sensitivity about it. The way the words that are mentioned, when we look at it, when applications come to us, it's shocking. It's just not the way to treat a person who is having a mental issue. So therefore, sensitivity, larger contours of the solution come centrally, leave the 3 tiers to then put in flesh wherever they think they need to do it. Thank you.
Okay. I think we've covered a fair amount of ground, and I think we've set the stage for perhaps this conversation to begin here today, which I think was the real motive of Vidhi to do this. It's been wonderful listening to all of you. I wish we could do television discussions with the ease and comfort that we can do it here on Zoom. There, unfortunately, noise sometimes takes over from news, but the challenges of the media, and I hope that Vidhi will one day also give us a new media law, which we so desperately need. But for now, I'm going to hand it back to Prasanna for a vote of thanks. Thank you all very much. Justice Patel, Mr. Mehta, Abhay Bang, and Dr. Khorakiwala. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajdeep. And I think, and I speak for everyone here at Vidhi, usually we never treat our panels as the end of any discussion. It's usually the start of a discussion, which usually carries on to the inevitable dinner as part of the event. But unfortunately, this is one of those things that we've been robbed of due to the pandemic. We will have to end this soon, but before we end, it is my duty and my privilege to thank all of those who have been involved in making today's event a success. And I'd like to start, first of all, with the members of our board, Ms. Irina Vittal and Mr. Bose, Mr. Sumit Bose, who are with us today. I think Vidhi's journey would have been impossible without the contributions that the two of you have made. Furthermore, I'd like to thank Mr. Amit Chandra and the ATE Chandra Foundation, and also Mr. Ajay Parekh and the Tree of Life Foundation for their generous grants and funding, which has made the work at the Maharashtra office possible. We are of course always grateful to our funders who have taken out their time and to be here with us to see the work that we've done. It is a huge encouragement for us to keep our work going. I'd like to thank Mr. Vijay Kelkar for his keynote address. It was a very insightful, thought-provoking address, and of course, I'm delighted that we are now seen as the standard for writing, and it's a very high praise that we have to keep up to. I'd like to thank our panelists, Justice Gautam Patel, Dr. Anand Bang, Mr. Ajoy Mehta, and of course, Dr. Rahela Khorakiwala for what was a very deep dive into some of the issues that, while of course we discuss it in the context of Maharashtra, I think anyone, anywhere in India would have benefited from this kind of a discussion. Thank you all for taking out time from your very busy schedules for being with us today, especially Justice Gautam Patel and Dr. Anand Bang and Mr. Ajoy Mehta. And of course, given all the connection difficulties and everything else, we still managed to have what I thought was a really invigorating debate and discussion. Of course, the discussion wouldn't have been the success that it was without our moderator, Mr. Rajdeep Sardesai. He has always been a well-wisher of Vidhi in so many different ways. And I think a lot of our success also owes to the kind of support that he's given us in many different contexts. Speaking of our well-wishers, I also spotted in our audience Ms. Anu Aga, Mr. Ashok Ganguly, Ms. Almitra Patel, Justices B.N. Sri Krishna and Dr. Radhakrishnan of the Supreme Court and the Bombay High Court respectively, Mr. Indu Bhushan and Mr. Sahu. I'm only naming you just because I happen to spot, and I think you have supported us in the past in various ways, and I hope you will continue to do so. And I'm extremely grateful that you took out time to be part of this event. Thanks to Rahela and her team in the Maharashtra office, Sakshi Pawar and Vistas Pirani. You have sort of overseen this fantastic bit of work, and I know a lot of our Vidhi colleagues have also contributed to it. But I think the amount of work that you've put in to make sure that this briefing book comes out, and the fact that it is of such a high quality, and Dr. Vijay Kelkar's praise is going to ring in our ears for a while to come. I think it's quite commendable. And finally, but definitely not the least, thank you all for attending this event. We know that this is the age of Zoom fatigue, but it's really heartening to know that the cause of legal reform has such enthusiastic and interested participants who have taken out about an hour and a half in their evenings to be with us today and to witness this discussion. Thank you all once again for having graced this occasion with your presence. And I would like to end by saying, please join us for dinner, but I'll have to end with, I hope you all have a good evening. And please do stay in touch and continue the conversation with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta.